The Rambam opens up Hilchos Chanuka with an entire historical background, the Bayesheni, etc., etc. Rambam tells us that after the great Yeshua of Chanuka, Beis HaMikdash stood for another 200 years until the Churban. That's Halacha Aleph. In Halacha Beis, the Rambam says that after the great victory, Yishigmavu Yisrael Alevehem, and the Rambam tells us about the fact that they looked in the Heichal, they couldn't find Shementar, etc., etc. That is a great miracle. Says the Rambam in Halacha Gimel, Mipnei Zeh, Hiskinu Chachamim, listen carefully to the language of the Rambam. Hiskinu Chachamim Sheba'oso Adar, Sheyu Shmonas Hayomim Ha'elu, Shetchilasan Milel Chamisha V'Esrim V'Kislev Yemei Simcha V'Hala Umadlikin B'Hen HaNeros Ba'erev Al Pischei Abatim B'Chol Laila U'Laila Mishmonas HaLeilos Laharos U'Legalos HaNes B'Yomim Elu Nikroim Chanukah V'Masur V'Hespei V'Tainis Yimei Apurim Padlokas haneros bahen mitzvah midivrei sofrim kikriyas hamegillah. Notice that the Rambam can be split into two parts. It's like a Reisha and a Sefer. In the Reisha, the Rambam defines the nature of the takana. Hiskinu chachamim sheba'osa adar, and these should be yemei simcha v'hala. Umadlikin b'hem neros b'erev. Very strange. The Rambam's language seems to be a little bit off kilter. He should have said, "Umipnei zeh kinu chacham shebos adar," etc., etc. That these days should be yemei simcha v'halel v'adlokas neros. Instead, he says, "Umadlikin b'hem neros laharos legalos hanes." And then it's the Sefer of the Rambam. The Rambam seems to catch his own mistake, catch himself on a mistake, and all of a sudden he reminds himself, Hadlokas haneres behen mitzvah divrei sofrim. So in the original definition of the takana, the Rambam does not include Hadlokas haneres, at least not in the same language that he does as far as Simcha V'Halel, but he just says Madlikim him. It's almost like the Rambam is codifying a minhag. You know, it's a nice minhag to be madlik v'neros, wherever al pischei abotim lahudiyas hanes. But then the Rambam says, don't make any mistake about it. Hadlokas haneros is a mitzvah. It's not just a minhag. And the one who noticed this is the Avnei Nezer, the Sokachover, and he thinks that maybe the Rambam is telling us that the takana of Ner Chanukah was only after the Churban Abayis. Remember, the Rambam emphasized that the Bayis stood for another 200 years. And although there was like a spontaneous, I would call it almost a grassroots movement to light Neros, but it wasn't established as a separate takana. As long as the Mikdash stood, which was another 2 centuries after the Chachmei Oso Adlor, there was never an established mitzvah of Chanukah, of Ner Chanukah per se. There were days of Simcha and Hallel, but not days of Ner Chanukah. When did the takana of Ner Chanukah as a separate takana emerge? Only after the Churban Abayis, 2 centuries later. An amazing chiddush of the Avnei Nezer. But it's very meduyik in the language of the Rambam, because the Rambam, as we said before, splits between Madlikim v'Hamaneros, and then only at the end, Mitzvah Midivrei Sofrim Lahadlik v'Hamaneros. So I'd like to understand, why would it be that the Takanas Chachamim of Ner Chanukah as a separate mitzvah hadlaka would only emerge after the Churban Abayis? And on the other hand, if there was no takana of Ner Chanukah, why does the Rambam feel compelled to codify a minhag? I call it a grassroots minhag, the amcha, that they would be madlik es haneros Laharos ulegalos hanes. I mean, if there was no takana, it's very nice that they had such a minhag, but why would the Rambam include them? Let's take a look for a moment. Yeah.
And why does the Rambam say Mason?
It's a different discussion. I mean, that's a sheer unto itself. Why would they establish the days of sin?
Well, I mean, the way that
I mean, if you have an answer to that question, that's perfect. I mean, I wasn't.
No, I'm not saying I.
There's a whole discussion. There's a chiv suda on Chanukah, and they want to base it on this Rambam.
No, but what I'm saying is, that if the Rambam here is, as you say, mentioning like grassroots minhag or just ideas, then maybe you want to say that Yemei Simcha is in the same fashion. Would you say that Yemei Simcha also is just a nice idea?
No, not at all. The Rambam says that was takana, 8 days, and what are those 8 days? Yemei Simcha v'Hala.
But
no, the Rambam is clearly telling you that the essence of takana, the chiv Chanukah, is Simcha and Hala.
What I'm trying to time now is that maybe how the person is saying Hala, that's part of the takana. Maybe Yemei Simcha is the way that it's related to how we see itself.
Yeah, but it's not Meduik in the Lashon Ram, because Ram put Simcha and Hallel together as a definition of the takana. No, but then he says Umadlika b'neros. It's like a matter of fact, and I think you should also know that they were madlik neros. You know, the Ram doesn't say Yemei Simcha ve'Hallel ve'Hadlokas haneros. That would have been the natural way that the Ram should have formulated, defining the nature of the day and the obligations that are generated by the day. He shouldn't have stopped at Simcha the Hallel. He should have added Halokas Neros. Instead, he sort of, through the back door, he says, Madlika b'maneros. And he gives a reason for it. You know, Kidei laharos legalos hanes. And then, at the end, he comes back to square one to tell us, hey, I forgot to mention that there's a mitzvah divrei sof, Madlokas haneros. It's not just through the back door that they were madlikim as haneros. And the Avnei Nezer noticed this, and he came to a very sensational conclusion that when the Rambam at the beginning of the halachas talked about Chachmei Oso Ador, the Mikdash was standing. And at that point, the days of Chanukah were only established as Yemei Simcha v'Hala. When was Hadlokas Neros upgraded to a separate mitzvah that becomes part of the essence of Chanukah? That's only 2 centuries later after the Churban. So I'm going to try to see if I can spend the rest of the shir explaining the Avnei Nezer. He doesn't explain himself. Let me just point out that if you look at the famous brisa of my Chanukah, which is on Daf Chaf Aleph Amid Beis in Masechta Shabbos, the brisa says, "Tana Rabbana b'Chaf Hei Kislev Yemei Chanukah," and it goes on to say the entire background of the miracle. And then it says, Kavum v'asaum, they established them and made them Yomim Tovim. What does it say next? B'Hallel v'Odah. Again, Simcha is not mentioned. That's a separate topic unto itself. But what's odd about it is there's no mention of Hadlokas Neros. It's only Hallel and Odah. What happened to Hadlokas Neros? Iker Chosim and HaSefer. I mean, if I would wake up in the middle of the night and ask you what Chanukah is about, I think you would probably answer, at least no, I would answer. It's about Hadlokas Neros. It's very nice, Hallel and Odah. I'm not denying that. But according to the Avnei Nezer, I think it's very meduyah, because the brisa is talking about Chachmei Oso Adar, and the Mikdash is still standing. In fact, this brisa that's quoted in the Gemara is from what's called Megillas Tainis. Megillas Tainis was authored while the Mikdash was still standing. Hill and Shammai were alive, but Beis Hill and Beit Shammai were after the Churban. So when you talk about Beis Hill and Beit Shammai after the Churban, you can talk about Ner Chanukah as we know it, as a separate mitzvah. You can have machlokas, whether it's supposed to be holy, or the popes, can I get this, can I get that? But when you talk about the original brisa, which was authored at the time of the Mikdash, there's no mention of Hadlokas Neros. And that can only make sense if you accept this diuk in the Rambam, that Hadlakas Neiros as a mitzvah was only established as the Avnei Nezer after the Churban. So the Brisa, which is talking about this man based on LaMikdash, could certainly not mention Hadlakas Neiros. Again, it was a very nice minhag, but it wasn't part of the establishment of Hanukkah. Now, let me ask you a question. When I lived in the dormitories at Yeshiva University, I'm going back a lot of years. You guys weren't alive then. Anyway, we used to light candles in the dormitory on the windowsill. Here I don't think we have much of a windowsill. Here's a windowsill, right? So what would we do? Sometimes we didn't have a menorah. So we would take a wax candle and plop it down on the chayach. Yeah, I'm not talking about security issues. Many, many years later, I got a hold of a sefer. Unfortunately, I don't have it accessible now, so you'll have to trust me, but look it up. There's a very major institution here that studies Kisvei Yad. It's called Moriah. Are you familiar with it? So anyway, they have a Ksav Yad from the Ravid. And the Ravid writes that it's not enough to light candles. You have to light candles in a menorah. And he says, because the nest took place in the menorah Shebemikdash, we need a menorah. And by the way, you should know, when I saw this Ravid, on the one hand, I was a little upset because we weren't makfid on a menorah, but we didn't have one. But on the other hand, I was very excited because one of the first dates I went out with was a girl from Borough Park. I'm not going to go into details about Borough Park right now, but I come into the house and they're lighting a menorah. If I told you that menorah was worth $20,000 or $30,000, then I would be underestimating it. You had to climb up to this menorah. It was made out of pure gold. And I said to myself, you know what? This is Amaratzis. No offense. Because a menorah is not a cheftzah mitzvah. There's no Zecher in the menorah. Zecher is in the Eish, it's maybe in the wicks possibly, but not in the menorah. But Kuptais, according to the Ravid in this Ksav Yad, it could be that the menorah is a cheftzah mitzvah. We want to spend a lot of money if we can, not more than a shlish, but to be mahad in the mitzvah of the menorah. But I want to show you another Ravid, which is a pella of a Ravid. This is the Ravid at the end, in Asagas Ravid, at the end of Hilchos Brachos. The Rambam establishes that a mitzvah derabanan, like for example, Mikra Megillah, gets a bracha with an al Mikra Megillah, Sugim Psachim Dabzan. A mitzvah d'oraisa, on the other hand, gets a bracha with a lamed. So the Ravid asks the following: Kashali, I can understand that al Mikra Megillah gets an al because it's the Rabbanan. But what are you going to do with Ner Chanukah? The Nusach HaBracha for Ner Chanukah is with a lamed, Kashali Ner Chanukah. And the Ravid gives two answers. The first answer is very complicated, and I don't understand it, so I'm going to skip it. But the second answer to the Ravid is fascinating. He says, Shezua bracha, this bracha of Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah, Hukba'ah, was established al haneros shebemikdash, shehein shel Torah, meaning it's a mitzvah d'oraisa, v'aloskos haneros, and the bracha was originally established on the Ner shebemikdash, when the Kohen would light the menorah, and therefore gets a lamed and not an al. But the Ravid has to answer another question. Today, we're not Kohanim, we're not lighting the menorah in the Mikdash. Why do we borrow the Nusach HaBracha of lamed from the Ner Shebemikdash? And he writes, just let me read the Ravid so we give him a chance to answer the question. He says, As'uha kishel Torah. As'uha, they made the hadlaka like a shel Torah. What's this all about? You're talking about a mitzvah d'Rabbanan that was established by the Chachmei Oso Adar, and it's clearly a mitzvah d'Vrayim. And the Ravid, here, take it. It's the last Ravid in Hilchos Brachos. Yeah, and clearly, the Nusach HaBracha says the Ravid should be no different than that of Megillah. Al Hadlokas Ner Chanukah. I don't know of any community, but tell me if you know of one that makes a bracha al Hadlokas Ner Chanukah. And yet the bracha is lahadlik ner Chanukah. And the Ravid says asua shel Torah because the original bracha was kavua on the ner shebemikdash, which is doraisa. And they forget the bracha with the lamed. Hell of a Ravid. But I think if you put these two Ravids together, we have a beautiful understanding of the nature and the essence of the mitzvah of ner Chanukah. The mitzvah of ner Chanukah is a duplicate of the Ner Shebemikdash. The Gemara in Masechta Sukkah asks about the Mishnah Takana Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai to take lulav kol shiv. And the Gemara says that why do we take a lulav for 7 days in Gvulin? I mean, the Torah says, "Uspachtem l'fnei Hashem Elokeichem shivas yomim." There's a mitzvah of lulav d'oraisa in Mikdash, but not in Gvulin. And the Gemara says, Mishum Zecher LaMikdash. So the Gemara asks me, Nolan Avdinan Zecher LaMikdash. Well, what's the source for this? You have a new mitzvah. It's a Baltoismi. You're adding a new mitzvah called Zecher LaMikdash. Where's the basis for that? And the Gemara quotes a pasuk in Yeshayahu Hanavi. No, I'm sorry, in Yirmiyah Hanavi. And Yirmiyah, when he castigates the Jewish people, he says, Tzion he doresh einlo. Nobody is being doresh Tzion. Michlal, says the Gemara, Diboy Drisha. So everyone and their uncle asks the Kasha, the Gemara is asking for a source that we should remember the Mikdash, Zecher LaMikdash. I have a pasuk for that. Imesh kachech Yerushalayim, tishkach yemini. But I heard once from my Rebbe's of Salvation that there are 2 categories of Zecher LaMikdash, and we shouldn't mix them together. There's one Mechayev of Zecher LaMikdash, which is derived from Imesh Kachech Yerushalayim, which is called Zecher LeChurban. We have to remember the destruction of the Mikdash. But the Gemara here is not dealing with the destruction of the Mikdash. The Gemara is dealing with replicating what went on in the Mikdash. We are going to duplicate the mitzvah as it was fulfilled in the Mikdash. So that when we take a lulav for 7 days, it's not Imesh Kachech Yerushalayim. It's not because of the Churban. It's to remember the Mikdash b'tif arta. And I remember our Salvation went very far with this. He says that when we duplicate what went on in the Mikdash, we imagine as if we were standing in the Mikdash and we implement the Ma'aseh Mitzvah as if it was done in the Mikdash. That's Mikdash b'tif arta. And for that, the Gemara is seeking a source. And the source is to be Doresh Tzion. Doresh Tzion means remember the Tiferes, the beauty of the Beis HaMikdash. Repeat that which was done in the Beis HaMikdash and imitate it. And Rabbos, if you would have asked me, what is the essence of Ner Chanukah? I would have told you Zecher L'Nes. Remember the miracle. Isn't that the way you were brought up? That's the way I was brought up. But now we have a whole new pshat. And we're offering a new perspective on Ner Chanukah. And it might have an afkamin in terms of the kavanah that you have when you light Ner Chanukah. The mitzvah of Ner Chanukah is not Zecher L'Nes. It's Zecher L'Mikdash. It comes under this drasha of Tzion hi Tiboy Drisha. And we are placing ourselves into the Beis HaMikdash Kaviyot and repeating the Ner. And if that be the case, then the Ravid says it makes sense that the bracha that was originally established on the mitzvah of Ner Shebemikdash, namely Lahadlik Ner, because the mitzvah d'oraisa, is going to be borrowed, in a sense, cloned onto Ner Chanukah. What's that? Ner Chanukah is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, no different than Kriyas HaMegillah. So you can make an Al Kriyas HaMegillah and a Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah, a Suah Kishel Torah. What's Pshat a Suah Kishel Torah? What's the private mean? But according to the Avnei Nezer, that they established the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah as a separate mitzvah, the Rambam at the end of Halach and Gimel, mitzvah v'divrei sofrim lahadlik es haneros, that mitzvah emerged after the Mikdash was destroyed. So the Rabbanan wanted to create a Zecher LaMikdash because we're obligated to look for every opportunity to create a Zecher LaMikdash. How do we create a Zecher LaMikdash as far as the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash? Balos chas haneros. So the Rabbanan looked here and looked there, and they came up with Chanukah, but they had a problem because the Mikdash is still standing. How could they establish a mitzvah of Ner Chanukah as a Zecher LaMikdash when the Mikdash is right here? And every day they're lighting the menorah. So they postponed this takana until after the Churban Abayis. With the Churban Abayis, they established a new mitzvah, B'divrei Sofrim, called Zecher LaMikdash, to light the menorah. We're going to use the same bracha that we will mevarech on the mitzvah d'oraisa, on the mitzvah d'rabbanan. And the Mela, we need a menorah, says the Raivi. Why do we need a menorah? Because if you're creating a Zecher LaMikdash, you want it to be as similar as it possibly can to the original mitzvah d'oraisa in the Beis HaMikdash. Just to take a candle and plop it down on the shayish, in kol hakavod, but where's the menorah? You're missing the essence of Zecher LaMikdash. And if that be the case, as I said before, there should be a kiyum of Hidur mitzvah in the menorah itself. Again, I'm not telling you to buy an old gold menorah. For that, you have to go to Borough. My father-in-law had a different name for Borough, but that's not for now. Yeah, anyway. Which thing again? I can't hear you.
The regular things people use that.
The regular something.
Regular bar.
Bar.
Yeah, what's that?
Could be. Could be. Maybe it is menorah. I don't know. But at least there's some sort of kibul there. I mean, you have to know this puts on Shabbos. Yeah. Has a Torah's clean? Maybe, I don't know. I don't want to go too far with this, but I'm just giving you a little new insight, I think, into the mitzvah of their Chanukah. And I would tell you like this, we have a machlokas whether mitzvah tzrichas kavanah or ain't tzrichas kavanah. But when it comes to a Zecher, whatever the Zecher is, mitzvah tzrichas kavanah. In fact, the Gemara has a havamina that since shofar is called zichron trua, you have to have kavanah for the mitzvah of shofar. And tokel l'shir lo yatzah. And Rashi says he's a misasek. Why is he misasek? Just because he's blowing for shir? I mean, he knows he's blowing a shofar, albeit not for the mitzvah. But the answer is because the Torah says zichron. Whenever you have a mitzvah zechira, you need kavanah. So I'm going to tell you again. I'm not paskening alof l'maisa, but in the presentation of our discussion, when you light the ner Chanukah, it's not enough to have in mind Zecher l'nes, that the miracle took place, and I want to publicize it. You have to have in mind Zecher l'mikdash, Tzion hi by Drisha. And that mitzvah of Zikaron l'mikdash requires kavanah. I'm sorry? That also you need a bracha on the lulav because it's Zecher l'mikdash. Again, if it was only a Meshkachei Yerushalayim, you would not make a bracha. That's remembering the churban. But if you're duplicating it, then the Rabbanan through Zecher l'mikdash are creating a new mitzvah, and you make a bracha. You don't say Lita also lulav? Well, I'll tell you why. The reason, okay, I haven't answered that question, but I don't want to get off on a tangent. I have a lot to tell you. Okay. Now I want to share with you a Baal Amor. This is the first Baal Amor in Perek Bameh Madlikin. An amazing chiddush of the Baal Amor. The Baal Amor says the following. The Gemara presents on Daf Chafal from the days in Shabbos Machlokas as to whether or not you're allowed to be mishtamish with the ner Chanukah. Says the Ravid, Laman di Omer also mishtamish with ner Chanukah. First Baal Amor. Did I say Ravid? I meant to say Baal Amor. First Baal Amor in Bab Perek Bameh Madlikin. He says, Laman di Omer also mishtamish the orach shel ner Chanukah. Kol tashmish v'mashmish. Afilu tashmish the mitzvah. B'tashmish the kedusha. So imagine, Rabbi say it's Friday night of Chanukah. Sometimes you get two for the price of one. This year it's only one. And you want to eat your Suda Shabbos to the Ner Chanukah. Says the Ravid, even though that's the Tzorach mitzvah, it's prohibited. And the Ravid's going to ask himself why. And by the way, Shmuel understands that if you're not allowed to be mishtamish b'ner Chanukah, it's only because of bizui mitzvah. But bizui mitzvah wouldn't apply if you're using it for another mitzvah. Says well, let's say you're learning Torah, right? So the weekday, not even on the Shabbos. So you need light for your study of Torah. You want to use the light of Ner Chanukah. No, says the Baal Amor, it's awesome. Why? Listen carefully. Kevan shehem zecher l'neros u'l'shemen shel heichal asuros heim ba'ana kol ikar. Afilu likro b'sefer, afilu sudat Shabbos, sudat mitzvah. Unbelievable. The Baal Amor is claiming that the din of the shemen is not just the din of mitzvah, chefetz shel mitzvah and the zenisa bizui mitzvah. No, the status of the shemen al pi din is that of the heichal shemen shebeheichal. The shemen shebeheichal is kachim, and you're not allowed to have any benefit from shemen shebeheichal. And I believe that you can support the sheet of the Balamor from the nusach of the Bryce of Divrei Sofrim, the Bryce of Masechet Sofrim that we recite. I think even the Sfaradim, I think it's all over the show. And that is Haneros Halolu Kodesh. And you know what the word Kodesh means? Now it takes on a whole new meaning. Kodesh means it has the status of Hegdesh. And if it has the status of Kodshim, then it's also Vano Kolika. Even with Tzorach Mitzvah, you can't use Kodshim for a Tzorach Mitzvah. And all this makes sense if you assume that the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah is Zecher LaMikdash. And they gave the Ner a din and a status of the Ner Shebeheichal, the Ner of the Migdash. The Gemara Masechta Shabbos on of Beis Amid Beis presents a suffix. He boiled it. Hadlokos of mitzvah or hanochos of mitzvah. So Rashi says hadlokos of mitzvah. Rashi says ha mitzvah shel Chanukah tfuya b'hadloka umadlikiv. Why do we need a Maisad Hadloka? It's not enough to put the Ner, let's say a Cheresh would light the Ner Chanukah, you, a Gadol, would put it down in the right place. That's not enough according to the Yom that Hadlokos. Says Rashi, Kida Ashkechan b'menorah. Rashi says, because in the menorah, in the Mikdash, we needed a Maisad Hadloka. Hanocha would not suffice. So I want to raise the following question. Both sides, according to Rashi, what's the other side of the Gemara? Oh, Dilma Hanochos of mitzvah. If Rashi is saying that Hadlokos of mitzvah is Kida Ashkechan b'menorah sheb'mikdash, then what do we do with that man that says Hanochos of mitzvah? Does it mean that the man that says Hanochos of mitzvah is completely rejecting everything that we said tonight of Zecher LaMikdash? So to answer this question, I believe we have to go back to the Beis HaMikdash. The Rambam in Hilchas Bias Migdash, Perek Tes Halacha Zayin, has an amazing chiddush, and the Ravid is very upset about it. The Rambam says that Hadlochas Haneros Kshera Bizarin. A non-Kohen could light the menorah in the Mikdash. What does that mean? Says the Rambam, because a Zar can't go into the Heichal, so the whole Rambam makes no sense. The Rambam says, I'll explain it. Leficha. He says that the Kohen prepared everything in the Heichal, and Hotzias HaMenorah, they took the menorah outside the Heichal, and the Rambam says the Zar was madlik the Ner outside the Heichal, and then the Kohen brought the menorah back into the Heichal. And the Ravid says hiflik. Hiflik means come on, give it a break. That's means. The Torah says ba'alos v'saneros. That's a mitzvah of Kohen. How can you tell me that the Zar lit? So you solved the problem. You circumvented the problem of what? Of how a Zar could be lighting the menorah by telling me that they took the menorah outside and then they took it back in after the Zar lit it. But what about the mitzvah Hadloka? Says Reb Chaim, Yidush Reb Chaim Alevi al Rambam. The Rambam holds Hanira B'das HaRambam is spiritually called Ikar Mitzvahs Ner Shemimigdash. Ain't a mitzvah be etzem Maisa Hadloka. It's not a din in the Maisa Hadloka, but that the Heichal should be equipped with a Ner Dolok. Therefore, since the Kohen is going to guarantee that there's a Ner Dolok in the Heichal, that is a Kiyama Mitzvah, Balos Chasaneros. It doesn't matter. As we say in Yiddish, who cares if the Zar did the Maisa Hadloka? The mitzvah according to the Ram is not the Maisa Hadloka. The causative. You have to cause that there should be a Ner Dolok in the Beis HaMikdash. Is Memela, I understand according to Chaim Hanochos a mitzvah. Bein Laman Diora had Lokos and Mitzvah, Bein Laman Diora had Nochos and Mitzvah, the Mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, Zecher LaMikdash. But how do we define the Mitzvah of the Mikdash? That's what we're arguing about. The Machlokas in the Gemara is not a suffix in Hilchas Chanukah. Be a Soda Shaldover, the suffix in the Gemara is in Hilchas Mikdash. In the Mitzvah of Baaloscha, how do you define it? One man Diyomar says that the Mitzvah is the Mais Hadlok. Hence, Hadlok also Mitzvah, Ner Chanukah. The other man Diyomar says, name. You don't need Hadlok. You need a Ner Dolok. And that's where the Kohen comes in. His mitzvah is to make sure that there's a Ner Dolok in the Heichal. That's called Hanochos of Mitzvah. Okay, I didn't get a chance to check, but the Rambam says that in the case of Ner Chanukah, we have to go beyond Beis Hamikdash because of another key, which we'll get to in a minute, and that is the Maisa Adloka. But as far as the Iker Mitzvah is concerned, the way we're defining it as Zecher LaMikdash, the Rambam L'Shitasa would hold Hanochos of Mitzvah. So what we gain by this is an explanation for that Man Diyomar. How do we justify Hanochos of Mitzvah? It's interesting. The Mishnah Berurah tells us a new insight into Hadloka b'Beis HaKnesses. This is Siman Taf Reish Ayin Al. The Beis HaKnesses, says the Mechaber, Meinicho b'tzad b'kosel dorom. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Os Mem, Hatam Zecher lemenorah shemakoma b'migdash v'dorom. So I have a hodah b'mikzas here from the Mishnah Berurah. He's not saying what we're saying. But what he is admitting is that the Hadlok in the Beis HaKnesses is definitely Zecher lemenorah sheb'mikdash, and therefore we like this Hadara. We're going a step further, and we're saying that even Hadlok b'bayis, although it has many dimensions to it, but fundamentally it is Zecher lemenorah sheb'mikdash. And now, Rabbosai, I want to drop a bomb. What we're saying today is right. This will shed a whole light on the Ramban's introduction to Parshas Baaloscha. You know that Rashi at the beginning of Baaloscha asks the famous question, Lama nismecha Parshas HaMenorah leChanukas HaNesiyim. Right, they did a Chanukas Beis HaMikdash, the Nesiyim, and that is codified at the end of Parshas Noso, and we read that on Chanukah. And now, immediately afterwards, the mitzvah of Ner Sheb'mikdash. So Rashi says that Aaron HaKohen had Chalisha Sadas. You remember Rashi? Because he and his Shevet were not part of the Chanukas HaMikdash. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu came to be Menachem Aaron by giving him the mitzvah of Ner Sheb'mikdash. Says the Ramah, Lo nisbarli loma nechama badlokas haneros, lo nechama b'ktores, Boker v'erev, sheshimcha kosav yasim Torah ba'pecha, ubechol hakarbonos, ubamenachos, ubeminchas chavitim, ubavodas Yom HaKippurim, she'ein kshera elabo. Aaron is a as a Kohen Gadol, is a precondition in avodas mikdash on Yom HaKippurim. He has the special mincha, the minchas chavitim. And the Torah, there's so many opportunities and so many different dimensions of the Avodah Sheb'mikdash that could have been chosen for the Nechama. Says the Ramban, Ra'isi the Yilamdenu. There are many, many different midrashim. This course, the Medrash Yilamdenu. Amallah Kodesh Baruch Hu Moshe. Lech emor li Aaron. Al tisyore. Don't be down in the dumps. We never want to be down in the dumps, right? But you shouldn't be down in the dumps in that you were omitted from the Chanukas HaNesiyim. Why? Ligdola mizos atamucha. I have something for you that's greater than the korbanos of the Nesiyim. Korbanos calls man shebeis hamikdash kayom heim noagim. With the Churban Abayis, there's no korbanos. So great, the Nesiyim brought the korbanos, but tell the Nesiyim that their mitzvah is a temporary time-end mitzvah, and there'll come a time when there is no korbanos. Aval haneros, here's the superior role of of Aaron HaKohen, the Neros, Li'olam, I emphasize that word, Li'olam, El Mul Pnei HaMenorah Iru. Says the Ramban. I don't get it. V'hine Yedover Yedua, says the Ramban. Kishe'ein Beis HaMikdash Kayim, HaKorbanos B'Telim B'nei Churbono, Af HaNeros B'Telos. What kind of nechama does Aaron get from Adlokas HaNeros that supersedes the Korbanos? The Korbanos depend upon the Mikdash, the Neros depends upon the Mikdash. Aval, says the Ramban, Peli Ploim of the Chiddush. Lo Ramzu El Neros Chanukas Kashbenoi. Shino Heges Afli Achar Churban Begolu Seif. We'll see you here. What is the Ramban talking? There's a mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, Mishum Zecher L'Nes. We have to remember the great miracle, correct? And that is a mitzvah Liolam, even after the Churban. What does that have to do with Balos Chasaneros? The Ramban is telling you pshat in the mitzvah of Balos Chasaneros. Where in Balos Chasaneros do you have a mitzvah that's Tomid Liolam even after the Churban? Okay, you have Ner Chanukah, wonderful. What's it done? What shaykhs is that? Praktish. It doesn't stem. But the answer is that when we light Ner Chanukah, we are duplicating what the Kohen did in the Beis HaMikdash. This is Zecher LaMikdash. This is Sioni Ubai Drisha. Is Memela, you should know that we don't have a Zecher LaMikdash for Karbanos, be too complicated. But when there was Chanukah, the Rabbanon jumped on the bag one and he'll bishu as Zecher LaMikdash on Ner Chanukah. They said here's an overlap of two possibilities. We have Ner Chanukah, which is going to commemorate the great miracle in the Mikdash, and now we can create a Zecher LaMikdash out of that Ner Chanukah. And once they did so, then the mitzvah Paloscha becomes a mitzvah Tfilis Liolam even after the Churban. And from the moment of Churban on, that mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, of Ner Mikdash took on a different form. And now it becomes expressed in the manner of what? Of Ner Chanukah. And now I want to tell you that maybe we can give an answer to the following question. Why is it that Chanukah gets two brachas? I'm not talking about Shechiyonu. And the Rambam writes at the end of Hilchos Chanukah, what happens if you only have money for Ner Chanukah or Kiddush Hayom, Friday night Kiddush, and you have to decide where to spend your money? So the Rambam says that you will spend your money on Ner Chanukah. Why? Maktiv liknos shemen l'ner Chanukah, la'adlik Ner Chanukah, al'ayayim l'kiddush. He says, mutav lahaktiv Ner Chanukah sheyesh bo zikaron l'nes. If we integrate the Rambam at the beginning of Hilchos Chanukah, which was the Rambam here at the end of Hilchos Chanukah, we now have a hybrid mitzvah. What I mean by hybrid mitzvah is we have two dimensions to the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. Once the Mikdash was down after Churban, the Rabbanan established Chanukah as Zecher LaMikdash, as we began with the Rambam at the beginning of Hilchos Chanukah. And then the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah was a separate mitzvah. But there's another dimension to Ner Chanukah. And that's why I believe the Rambam codifies that spontaneous minhag of Madlikim b'maneros al peschi abatim b'chol laila u'laila. There was a grassroots movement, so to speak, to remember the Nes of Chanukah. And how so? By lighting Ner Chanukah. But the Rabbanan did not establish it as a mitzvah. After the Churban, when they established the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah as Zecher LaMikdash, then they added another dimension, and now you have a double kiyum in the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. You have Zecher LaMikdash and Zecher LaNes. And that extra dimension of Zecher LaNes expresses itself in the bracha of Sha'asa Nisim Lavosenu. So the first bracha of Lahadlik Ner Chanukah is on the Ikar mitzvah, which is established 200 years after the miracle, as a Zecher L'Churban, when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. And that's a Maisad Loka or Hanocha, according to one day, and that's Zecher LaMikdash. And that's the bracha of Lahadlik near Chanuka, which according to the Ravid, at the end of Hilchos Brachos, is a borrowed bracha from the Ner Shebamikdash. And according to the Balamar, it's on a Ner that has the din and status of Shemen Shel Heichal, and it's also Vana Kol Iker, even L'Shem Mitzvah. And on that takon of Zecher LaMikdash that we make a bracha on, Aaron HaKohen gets his nechama because he's given a mitzvah of Balos Chaneros, which is Li'olam El Pnei HaMenorah Iru. And then the Rabbanan said, you know what? Now that we're establishing a separate mitzvah Badlo, in order to re-experience and duplicate the Ner Shebamikdash, let's be malvich on that mitzvah, a Zecher L'Nes. And we're going to add a bracha of Asher Kidshanu Mitzvosav Ala Nisra. And now the Rambam says, once we've elevated this mitzvah of Ner Chanukah to a double status with two kiyuvim and two brachos, now if you have a choice between Kiddush Hayom and Ner Chanukah, you're going to choose Ner Chanukah because Ner Chanukah has a double kiyum. Also, we should be Zocher Mirz Hashem to be Makayim the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah Zecher LaMikdash Tzion Hi. We should be Doresh Tzion. And as a result, we'll be Zocher Mirz Hashem. The rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, the return of the menorah. Amen. Thank you so much. And I'll take this opportunity to wish you a very, very happy Chanukah.